Hello, everyone, and welcome to NOAA's webinar series. This is Mike McGowan, and I am going to serve as the moderator for the webinar. The topic for this webinar is effective IEP advocacy for children and students with albinism. NOAA is very lucky to have so many dedicated volunteer experts who are willing to share their time and talent with the albinism community. So what are we going to talk about this evening? Parents and guardians play an essential role in creating an IEP that best represents the needs of their children with albinism. Parents and guardians need to have knowledge of the IEP process to facilitate decision-making and actively contribute their knowledge to the IEP team. This seminar will highlight basic advocacy skills for parents and guardians, referral and eligibility procedures for an IEP, assessments specifically for students with visual impairments, and will include an overview of considerations for accommodations and placement services and placement and service delivery options for students with albinism. Our presenter tonight has graciously been kind enough to provide notes on a website that will be a part of the presentation, will be divulged during the presentation. So you don't have to be so concerned about getting every little thing down, because there are a number of resources out there, including what Kim has put on her website. So kind of sit back and try to absorb what comes along. The GoToWebinar software allows participants to ask questions using a chat feature, and I see that some of you have already figured that out because we got a couple of questions so far. Thank you. There's a spot on your screen where you can submit the written questions, so feel free to type them in as the presentation is going on, and I will go through them and select as many questions as we have time for at the end of the session and read them to our presenter. I just want to remind everybody that the webinar will be posted on NOAA's YouTube channel within a few days. So if you leave or experience any technical problems, please look for the recording on YouTube. And as you may have heard Kim and I talking a little bit, there's a thunderstorm rolling through Fairfax, Virginia right now, in case you don't have your Doppler radar on looking at that. And hopefully everything will be fine at Kimberly's house, and we will have her all the way through. So our presenter is, and I forgot to even ask you, Kim, pronouncing your last name.
Avila.
Avila. Okay, Kimberly Avila is a person with albinism, a mother, an experienced teacher of students with visual impairments, and an ACV REP certified orientation and mobility specialist. She is a contributing author to the NOAA parent book, Raising a Child with Albinism, A Guide to the Early Years, and has published several materials and articles in the area of blindness, visual impairment, multiple disabilities, and advocacy. Additionally, Kimberly has created a number of original curricula and has taught at the graduate level as an adjunct university faculty member, preparing service providers for blind and visually impaired. She has extensive experience working with persons who have visual impairments, from extremely premature infants to senior citizens and every age in between. Kimberly has been accepted into a doctoral program in special education at George Mason University and is the recipient of the prestigious National Leadership Consortium and Sensory Disabilities Fellowship. So without any further ado, we're very excited to have Kim present today, so take it away.
Thank you so much, Mike. And out of that long list of information, I really want to highlight that I'm a mom too, and I have a child with an IEP, and I've been in your position. So I'm not going to preach and tell you not to worry and cry or whatnot, because I've been there myself. So I'm really here as a fellow parent and ready to share some of my experience on all sides of the IEP table, from being the teacher to being the principal designee, to the person coming in when there's a problem, and of course, most importantly, when I'm the parent in the IEP. So I would first of all like to thank all of the wonderful parents who shared photos of their beautiful kids for this presentation. I do have this entire presentation on my website with just the text, without the photos. But in any case, these photos do belong to the parents and should not be copied under those circumstances. But thank you to all of you. They're fantastic pictures. NOAA has some very fantastic resources already that can help you. If you're not aware, NOAA has Project CARE, iep.albinism.org, and there are some fantastic resources and sample IEPs for you to look at, and you can also contact the Project CARE team if you have questions. So please take advantage of that resource if you haven't done so already. This is my website. If you go to vipsite.org, I do have all of the notes that I'll be presenting tonight. There's no way I'm going to get through all of this information in the next 50 minutes or so. So some of the topics I have to brush over quickly, you can read for yourself. I also have some other resources on there and a link to Project CARE for NOAA. Okay, IEPs are very complex, and I've trained a number of teachers to do IEPs. I also previously worked for the United States Senate and did a lot of work on the 1997 and 2004 amendments for IDEA. And I'm going to only have time to really brush over these basic topics of advocacy, basic advocacy, referral and eligibility, assessments, accommodations, and placement and service delivery options. You are welcome to email me if you have questions. I'm friends with a number of the folks in NOAA, and we correspond on a regular basis as is, but anyone is welcome to contact me. So 3 things that I want everyone, every parent, myself included, to remember about our children and putting them in school and developing an IEP is their safety is first and foremost on everybody's list. And I'm going to talk more about that in a few minutes, but it doesn't matter how good of an IEP you have or what great parents you are and what fantastic teachers you have. If their safety is being jeopardized in any capacity, we need to make sure that those issues are being addressed. Documentation and communication are really key in the IEP process. And as I've trained a lot of my teachers in training, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So I'm telling you all that as well. Everything needs to be documented that goes on with our kids in the IEP process. And finally, being proactive and being a good advocate means that you look toward what's coming up in the future and how you can proactively advocate for things that are to come. And that alleviates a lot of stress on everybody if we're all very forward-thinking in our process. Okay, so as I said, safety. These are a lot of the main safety concerns that we have for our kids, and as teachers we have for your children that we're caring for. There's typical school safety needs that we need to consider. The environment. For kids with albinism, there are environmental considerations we need to have. I have encountered a huge problem within the past few years. I've been called in by special education advocates who have me come to a school, beautiful brand new school that was built with green technology. And although we can all agree green technology is great for the environment, it's not so great for our kids who have albinism, for our students who have albinism, and also other vision conditions that cause extreme glare issues. There's other environmental considerations as well. Of course, physical, emotional safety, I'm sure you're all familiar with those concerns. Privacy needs to be a safety concern as well, and electronic. Within the past year, I've had 3 cases that have been brought to my attention where either a parent or a school accidentally sent confidential information to the wrong email address and disclosed quite a bit of personally identifiable information about either their student or their child to a source that should not have had privilege to that information. So please do, your school districts have requirements that staff have to meet for meeting privacy within electronic means, and just so you're all aware of that too. And I'm very sorry to report, in one of those cases, that was my daughter. The special ed teacher sent confidential information to mistype the email address. So it's I'm not exempt from all these problems either. So okay, I'm going to talk about a lot of terminology tonight. If I say VI, that stands for visual impairment. The technical term for professionals in my field is teacher of students with visual impairments or teacher of the blind and visually impaired. Previously, we were called vision teachers and vision itinerant teachers. For tonight, I'm just going to say TVI to be as succinct as possible. If I say O&M, that stands for orientation and mobility. And orientation and mobility is basically the process of helping our students determine where they're at, where they're going, and how they're going to get there, and all of the techniques to get there safely and effectively. So O&M is orientation and mobility, and TVI is for teacher of the visually impaired. All right, jumping in. Parents and guardians, you are extremely important to the process of advocating for your child in the IEP. And you know your child best, and they live in your home, and the information that you can bring is extremely important. I've seen the full gamut. I've seen parents who are absolutely terrified to talk because they don't want to say anything wrong, to parents who are savvy and, quite frankly, know things that I don't know. And that, you know, both families were ready to serve. But I really encourage you to be involved as much as possible, because the things that we're doing at school, we hope you carry them over at home. And things that you're doing at home, we hope that we can bring them to the school if they're working well for your child. So we want to make sure that that communication is really flowing so we can all be on the same page to best serve your child. So in order to do that, these are some things that I recommend parents do throughout your child's life, from pretty much the day they're born, even before they're born if you had prenatal complications or other issues. You do want to keep some documentation on your child, and this is going to be very helpful in making sure that you are directed in the way that you communicate with the service providers, and it also helps the service providers evaluate your child in all of their areas of strength and areas of need. So one of the easiest ways to do this, and I did this too for my daughter who has an IEP, is we make portfolios, and I made these for my students who are visually impaired and encouraged them to continue doing it on their own once they were finished with school. But when you make a portfolio, you're going to want to keep some notes in there about things that work for your child, things that don't work for your child, work samples, art samples, utensils and writing devices that are useful for them. Compile all of that. I have two kinds for my students and for my daughter. I have electronic, and then I also have my paper copies. I love electronic information because I can scan and I can save it on my computer, and it's one less book on my desk, but you can do it whatever way you're comfortable with. I encourage parents who have visually impaired children to keep developmental notes during their early childhood and, you know, mark down when they're doing milestones, which I'm sure a lot of you are doing anyway. But there's one big discrepancy that I've noticed. Sometimes we'll have kids who maybe start walking at 12 months. They take their first steps, but they're actually not really walking until 16 months, where they're walking as their primary mode of transportation and getting themselves around. So I recommend that you mark when the child first does that and when they do it permanently. And the reason why I say that is because we're seeing an increase in speech disorders and with autism. If we mark when they do those activities, you know, here and there, and then when it's permanent, that actually helps me identify if there's something else going on. But really, my daughter just finished kindergarten, and her portfolio from kindergarten is about 2 inches thick. I included in there work samples of worksheets that she did very easily, that came naturally to her, and things that didn't, that were very difficult. And so for a student who's visually impaired, the samples of worksheets that weren't good might be things that were visually cluttered or hard to see, maybe not enlarged correctly, and the examples of good work samples are like the clearly easy to see, high contrast, correct print, etc., that might work for that child. I can then take that portfolio to the student's next teacher and show them an example of what worked for that child and what did not. Okay, so we all know that we have to refer in order to get an IEP or an IFSP for early intervention. My biggest advice is to please refer early. In early intervention, our agencies have 45 days from the day that you call and make a referral to the day that they have to complete the assessment for evaluation for eligibility. And 45 days, I'm a mom, and I had my daughter has speech needs, and 45 days felt like an eternity. So please refer early. You can make your referral, and then you can take the child to the doctor and maybe get some other information. And if they think, everything's okay and things turn around, you can always cancel. But please do refer early. You need to continue referring throughout your child's education. When you move to new schools, if you know next March your family is going to be transferred somewhere else in the country, please do in September get in communication with that school district so they can transition your IEP smoothly. If you ever suspect that your child has another area of need, just refer. There is a time frame in which your schools have to complete those eligibility procedures, and you do want to make sure that you're maximizing that time. You're going to need documentation for the referral process, and for students with albinism, eye reports are going to be the main source of documentation you need from your eye doctor. So I always recommend to my students' parents, if you go once a year, and a lot of our kids go more often, but if you go once a year, just get the note from the doctor when you're there. And you can share it with your child's case manager and TVI, and that way they can know if there are differences. I'm working with a student right now who has something very similar to OA, and this child from age 5 was 2,400, and now age 6 is 2,250. No surgery, no interventions and whatnot, but kids just learn to use their eyesight better, so it's good for the TVIs to know that. You can also include any medical information. If you're seeing an occupational therapist, if you're seeing a developmental specialist, include that information. You can include your own comments and summary of your child's needs. I always wrote up a summary about my own daughter in my own words, and that was very helpful. And then when you're also referring, please do put your requests for assessments and your concerns in writing and provide them to the staff evaluating your child. When we are looking for children who are going to qualify for vision-related services, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and I have the reference on the screen, defines a visual impairment as an impairment in vision that, even with correction, adversely affects the child's educational performance. And we all know what the technical definition is of visual impairment in legally blind, the 20/70 or 2200 vision or restricted field. This piece of IDEA opens up a much more vague definition of visual impairment for school-related purposes, not for vocational rehabilitation or Social Security or whatnot. But for school purposes, I know when I first started as a TVI, I had a student with 20/40 vision who functioned very well but had a vision-related service because the student did not have any depth perception and had a lot of safety concerns that dealt with that. And the student also had a diagnosis of a condition that could possibly cause future vision loss. But this is something, some of you have children with OA or forms of OCA, they see 20/60, 20/40. You can certainly inquire about if you feel your child needs some support. And this is the part of IDEA that is really quite vague and throws professionals for a loop because we have to define this in our own parameters. So the keys to assessments are, the keys to our IEPs is good documentation and good assessments. And whenever I get called into a situation where there's a dispute with the IEP team and the parents, I go to the assessment data that was compiled for that student. And if I have an IEP team that's saying this student needs services for a learning disability, and the parents say my child with albinism does not have a learning disability, she's just visually impaired, I go to the assessment data. I look at the assessment. Did we do some assessments that check for a learning disability? Do we have documentation from previous years from teachers that would indicate a learning disability? And if not, then we need to get that documentation. Our assessments can range from informal to formal. They can, our informal samples are observations, checklists, and records. So these are things that I might complete or another service provider might complete. We do have standardized tests like the Woodcock-Johnson and other assessments. We can use those with our population. There's a lot of limitations, and there are some assessments that should not be used for children who have visual impairments. And we have a lot of non-standard assessments that we use for this population as well. The basic, most essential assessment for children who have visual impairments is the functional vision assessment. And this is where we look at how that child uses their eyesight beyond acuity. I can have two students who have albinism. Each has 2200 vision, and both of those kids use their eyesight completely differently. I can have one student who barely needs anything and another student who needs quite a bit more accommodation for their eyesight. So this is where we document and we find this information and we present it to the teachers and in the IEP, and we learn how we can work with that child's eyesight the best. One of my pet peeves in the field and working at a university and working with teachers a lot, this is a comprehensive assessment, so a little two-page summary just doesn't cut it. I'll tell you the shortest functional vision assessment I wrote was 14 pages, and that was for a student who did not qualify for vision services. But because I had to document in writing that that student had no issues that would affect his educational environment or safety, I had to make sure I documented everything very clearly. Because if something did happen, if he did have limited depth perception, and let's say he got hit in the face with a ball during PE, they would come back to me and say, why didn't you tell us this? And so this is something we need to take very, very seriously. I want to point out something about depth perception because there's been a lot of talk about this and some great research. Depth perception needs to really be taken very seriously. And as I said, the example about a ball being hit in the face, a special ed advocate contacted me a couple of months ago because a student had been hit in the face with a ball during PE, and the teacher said, we didn't know the student had limited depth perception. So there's some provisions we need to make. And an example I give of limited depth perception, and I know a lot of kids with albinism have this, myself including, the picture in the middle with the green grass and then like the mulch, and there's a railroad tie, that's on a playground, and that's a level change. That level change there is actually about 1.5 feet deep, but because it's a picture, it's two-dimensional. It does not, it's not three-dimensional. You can't really tell that. Well, that's how it would look. That's actually how it looked to the student who the special education advocate contacted me about. And so that's something we want to take very seriously. I've had concerns about kids with limited depth perception on the playground because they could not perceive, first of all, athletics and sports were difficult for them, but also the swing, kids on the swings with the big arc. They had a hard time perceiving how fast those kids were coming toward them and how high the arc was. So we have to teach them to walk far enough around, but there have been a couple cases where kids have been hit in that situation, and we, of course, don't want that to happen. We also check for things like judging visual clutter. I have the picture at the bottom, a sample of visual clutter. Unfortunately, visual clutter is very common today because we live in a society that really likes to have a lot of visual stimulation, and web pages are just so bloated with information that just stands out, and that's difficult for some of our kids. So I test about 25 different factors of that child's vision in the functional vision assessment and document how they do in that situation. Now, that being said, I did a functional vision assessment on a student just a couple of months ago for the upcoming fall IEP. I'm going to retest that student in September because sometimes, especially with little ones, what I see a few months ago, I will not see again in September, and because they change so quickly. And a lot of you have had kids with albinism who have delayed visual maturation, and you know what I'm talking about. At 6 months, they're functioning like they can't see a thing, and then by a year, they're all of a sudden seeing the world. So that's very important for us to document. The learning media assessment is the next really important assessment that we have to do. And according to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, we actually have to document when Braille is not going to be used by means of an assessment telling us so. We have to do an assessment to prove that Braille is not going to be used. Otherwise, Braille is considered the standard. So our learning media assessment is really going to see which mode of literacy is most important for that student, whether it be Braille, large print, adapted print, regular print, electronic means, audio format, or any combination of those. So the learning media assessment, again, is extremely important. For a lot of kids with albinism, we do have a number of folks learning Braille, but we do have a number who are using video magnifiers, closed-circuit TVs. using electronic text, using large print in different variations, magnifiers, and this is where I assess that. This is where I learn how my student is going to best get their information. We can do expanded core curriculum assessments. This is highly recommended in the field now. As I'm a contractor, a private contractor, that's one of the hats I wear in this field, and the most common assessment I get asked to do is assistive technology, and that's because we have a number of people who are not keeping up to date with the technology that's out there. And I want to tell you, there is nothing more gratifying for, as a parent and as a teacher, as to when we find that perfect technology that really makes a difference for a student. So the assistive technology assessments are very important. They really, for me, I coincide the functional vision, the learning media, assistive technology, and orientation and mobility assessments all into one big assessment. These assessments do not get done overnight. They are a process if they're done correctly. I observe the child in several situations. We bring in lots of devices. We worked with the families. We work in the school. We work out in the community. And again, because I have to document, hey, that kid can get on and off the bus without a problem. I have to document that. I can document that. I have to document that if we're going to be outside, we need to have glare provisions for this child, etc. Our assessments are ongoing. They need to be ongoing, and that is because, like I said, students' needs change. They get into school, the academic needs increase. For my students, hitting 7th grade is a big change. The print gets a lot smaller. The reading gets a lot heavier. So what the accommodations we're going to make for them will change. I've had a number of students, including students with albinism, who've switched from print to print and audio. I'm doing my PhD right now, and I have moved to an audio format and visual for my reading purposes, just because the reading is so hefty. So our assessments need to be ongoing. The expanded core curriculum, I just am going to mention this very quickly. I do an assessment of all of these areas to see what IEP goals would be relevant for my student to work on. You can Google expanded core curriculum, go to Texas School for the Blind and the American Foundation for the Blind, for example, and they have fantastic resources. You can read up more about this, but really the ECC is becoming much more commonly used, and the importance is being much more effective for us getting information and helping our students meet all of their needs. We can do a lot of assessments for students. As I mentioned, we have like the Woodcock-Johnson and so on, educational psychological assessments. I just want you to know that if the school psychologist is giving these assessments to your child, the TVI needs to consult. There are assessments that are being used that should not be used for kids who have visual impairments. When we do use a standardized formal assessment that is not specifically for kids who have visual impairments, we always include a disclaimer, a statement that says this test is not standardized on this population. So this is just giving us a frame of reference. It's not necessarily going to serve as a sole diagnostic tool. I'll let you read through this slide on your own if you want to read the handout that I have on my website, but we do encounter a lot of kids who are wrongly diagnosed with other disabilities when all they have is a visual impairment, or vice versa. So I've seen this a lot, and I'm sure some of you have stories to share as well. But for me as a TVI, when I am looking to see if a child has another disability, my first two questions to myself is this student accommodated appropriately? Because if they're not, their reading speed is going to be slow. They are going to have some trouble seeing things, and it might look like, to an untrained person, a reading disability. And then I'm going to ask myself, is this student proficient with using their accommodations? So we might have a magnifier and a CCTV and a monocular, but those are no good if they don't know how to use them. So I'm going to look at those two things before we start looking at other disabilities. There's a few key phrases you really need to know in preparing for an IEP. The first is the independent educational evaluation. If you get some data, some assessments from your child's school that you don't agree with or you do not think is comprehensive enough, you can certainly request an IEE, and that means that the school has to find an individual for you who is not employed by the school system, who will come in, do an assessment, and provide the results. I do these very frequently. This is the most common request I get from special ed advocates, whether it be assistive technology assessments, functional vision, learning media, expanded core O&M. This is the most, dozens literally a year, and it's just amazing. But you can request the IEE. You can also bring in your own. So I'll give you an example of an IEE I used for my daughter. She had an early diagnosis of a speech disability, and we went to a fantastic speech therapist, and we decided early on not to use the preschool system for her, the public preschool system. We used a private system, and I provided the documentation when I referred her for the IEP, and they didn't have to do an evaluation because it was complete and comprehensive. It was an independent educational evaluation. It wasn't a situation where I was, saying, oh, you're wrong and I'm right. It just, I brought it in and they said, great, she qualifies, done. And I was glad because we didn't have to re-diagnose her with her condition that she has. So that's something you can consider. A lot of people are doing private assessments anyway, so do bring that documentation in. There's a very dirty word in the field of special education. It's called predetermination. And this is something, as a teacher, you never want to be accused of because it's a very, very dirty word. And that means that you created an IEP and made major decisions about a child outside of an IEP meeting and without parental input. Now, this is mostly pertaining to things like service delivery options and placement and so on. Sometimes it is a good idea to, before an IEP, to ask for a copy of the goals and information they have in the IEP already so you can acquaint yourself with that before the IEP. But the really big decisions need to be made in the IEP meeting. And you want to make sure that anything that is written in the IEP, you have a say in. You can have a change in. They should never, ever just give you an IEP and tell you to sign it. That's not okay. So predetermination, you can read more about it online. Lots of cases from Wright's Law have been predetermination and so on. If you ever feel that something about your child changed or something is not appropriately addressed in his or her IEP, you always have the right to request an addendum. And that is a change to any part of the IEP. You can schedule that anytime. You do not have to wait for the child's IEP to expire in a year to be up for renewal. But the addendum, I've requested them without parents asking, simply because I saw a major change. I evaluated the student. We wrote the IEP in April. By September, they were on a completely different track. So we made an addendum to the IEP. That is your right at any time to do. So once we've made our referral, we've got our documentation and our assessments, it's going to be decided what type of plan they are going to develop. An individualized family service plan is for early intervention. An IEP is for ages 3 on up to 21. And then an ISP is an individualized service plan, which is commonly used with kids who go to private schools. Now, private schools is a little trickier because we can use a couple different opportunities to serve those kids. Some kids in private schools do have full IEPs. They go to the private school for most of their education, but then they go to a public school for an hour or two a week or more, and they get some type of service. A 504 plan actually falls under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. It does not fall under IDEA. But there are a number of kids with albinism. Maybe early on they have an IEP, but by the time they're 10th, 11th, 12th grade, and even younger, they transition to a 504 plan. And a 504 plan is written when it's decided that this child does not have any problem progressing in the general ed curriculum educationally wise, but they might need some type of modifications, environmental considerations to accommodate them, but it's not any change. No special education is needed. It's no change to the general ed curriculum either. In the IEP, you're going to write goals. You're going to look at that assessment. You're going to find out where the areas of need are with your child, and you're going to set goals. Now, for me as a parent, the goal setting was kind of the easy part. But what kind of always struck me was that we're always told by our school districts and so on, your child needs to be at this level. And in early intervention, they need to be walking and they need to be doing this, that, and the other thing by this date and so on. For me as a parent, the way I got through that, my daughter was extremely premature and had some issues with low tone and speech and et cetera. The way I got through that, when she wasn't meeting her milestones on time, I looked at she was making progress, and I was very happy she was making progress. I don't care if it's on someone else's timeline, she's on her own. And I looked at what is her personal best. So if you do have a child who has some other needs, think about what their progress is and celebrate that and look at what their personal best is. Sometimes we need to just forget that there are people out there who think they're experts on our kids, but we're the expert on them. There's lots of types of service delivery for children with visual impairments. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act really emphasizes that we use inclusion. This is also called mainstreaming. It's where our kids are put in the least restrictive environment and they're educated with non-disabled peers to the greatest extent possible. That's the priority. That doesn't work for everybody. It does not, and that's okay if that does not work for your child. We just need to make sure they're getting their placement needs met appropriately. So service delivery for kids with visual impairments and all special needs, in fact, range from monitor consult, which means that the teacher is basically a consultant. He or she might see your child once a month for a half hour or consult with you or consult with the teachers or whatnot, but it's not really special education. It's monitor consult where we just are a consultant. We might serve students in the general education classroom. So some schools call this push-in, where the special ed teacher comes into the classroom once in a while or on a regular basis, and they serve the child in the classroom, in the general ed classroom. Then we have special education services in the special education setting. That's often called pull-out, where the child leaves the general ed classroom, goes to a resource room, goes to a setting where they're in the special education setting. We have self-contained schools, which are like the School for the Blind. And then also in early intervention, Part C of IDEA says that kids are to be served, infants and toddlers are to be served in the natural setting, which is oftentimes at home. They need to be served, or in their daycare setting. So those are some of the service delivery that you could think about. I've had kids with albinism the entire gamut here, monitor, consult, clear to self-contained in the School for the Blind. And that's the decision of the IEP team. Of course, making that transition to being in a neighborhood school to being at the School for the Blind is a huge decision. So, if that's something that's an option for your child, that is a big decision. Accommodations is another huge component of the IEP. And we're going to decide what accommodations work for your child and how they best can be used. This comes directly out of our functional vision and learning media assessments and our other assessments that we have. So we're going to define what accommodations are necessary for your kid, for your child, and then I want to emphasize this because I'm so tired of seeing it. If your child needs training with accommodations, please make sure it is in your IEP. I've been called in probably a dozen times in the past year for a child who was given Zoom text or CCTV or a monocular, and they're complaining because he's not using it. And I go in there and the child doesn't know how to use it. They haven't been trained. And this is something I've developed a lot of curricula for using accommodations, and we want to make sure that they are able to use them. If you have large print in the IEP, we want to define what large print is. Technically, large print is considered size 14 font, which is not large enough for most of our kids who have albinism. There's a lot of benefits and limitations to accommodations, extended time. I've seen this work and I've seen it fail. I've seen students get far behind because they had extended time and they chose to procrastinate rather than using the extended time as necessary. I prefer to have the students get their assignments ahead of time so that they can work really hard on them and plan, and I can also have a hand in it and help them accommodate the assignment. Assistance, I've seen it succeed and I've seen it failed. Sometimes it depends on the type of assistant that you have that would cause it to fail or succeed. I've seen assistants do a whole lot for kids that they shouldn't have been doing, and I've seen assistants fall asleep in class and not do enough. Shortened assignments, that works great in a lot of cases, but in some cases the child actually needs more practice, like with their math problems. When you're defining testing accommodations in the IEP, please make sure they are very, very clearly spelled out. If your child is in 9th grade, 9th through 12th, planning to take the SAT, if they want more than 100% extra time, it has to be documented in the IEP for at least 1 year. And I've dealt with ETS a lot, and let me tell you, they are very strict about that. So you want to make sure those are defined very well in the IEP. One thing you can do to prepare for the IEP as well and kind of consider what your child might need. And what governs our education is the standard of learning, the standards of learning. So each subject, math, science, English, history, so on, have standards that children need to complete. Each state has adopted their standards based off of the national, and each county has adopted their own standards based off of national and state as well. So you can go online, if you live in Jefferson County, type in Jefferson County, Colorado, and type standard of learning or whatnot, and you can find what the standards are. I love these because I can say I have a child here going into 4th grade next year. What is he going to learn? I go to the standards of learning, I see what the curriculum is, what that child's going to have to do, and I can proactively start ordering materials for that child. I can start planning with the parents, what is he going to need, how can we best work with this, and it's very helpful. The counties also have something called a program of studies. It might be called something a little different where you live. It varies from each state to state and county to county, but I live in Fairfax County, Virginia, so we have our standards of learning, but on top of that we have our programs of study, and Fairfax has expanded on the standard of learning and made their own program. So for example, if I have a child going into kindergarten in September, I know I can look at our program of study and our SOLs. I know they're going to start learning about basic fractions, clock time. They're going to be experiencing a little bit with maps and so on. And I can plan for that child. And you can do this too, and I encourage you to do so, because you can start looking at classroom materials. Before the IEP, you can ask if the case manager can go in the kindergarten classroom with you and show you the things they're going to be doing. And we can look at something and say, that might need adaptations. Some teachers will show you their lesson plans. And as a TBI, I take their lesson plans and I adapt them beforehand. So for example, I had a student in kindergarten and they were doing a lesson on sink or float in these big glass bowls. And I was able to help that teacher understand, okay, we don't want the glass bowl to be by a window because the sun's going to shine in, it's going to cause glare on the water and the glass, and it's going to be horrible. We don't want to have too many things in the bowl at once because it's going to be visually cluttered. And finally, if the child had limited depth perception, I would say you're going to want the child to get down and look at the bowl from the side and not the top, because they're not going to see if it's floating or sinking. So, a lot of adaptations like that. But please do, before the IEP, tour the school, talk with the teachers, get some information about what they're going to be learning. This is something I did for my students, and I did for my own daughter, so it's something that I found very helpful, and we had a very good year with my daughter. There is something called quota funds, federal quota funds, and these are materials available from the American Printing House for the Blind. They are free to our students who are visually impaired. So we can order a lot of devices from APH for free that our kids can use. So these things can take a while to get to us, so we want to make sure we plan ahead. They have large print clocks, they have tactile learning devices, and so on, just a whole catalog. You can look through APH's website and see what they have. If you are if you're on the advocacy track, and by the way, that's a picture of me when I was like 14 or 15 years old, so I'd be silly and put it in. When you're advocating for things, literacy, of course, is huge. And I want to emphasize a few things. I know some of you have kids who are going to be learning Braille and print. I want to let you know that Braille literacy takes a lot of planning and intervention. They need to build a lot of tactile awareness skills in their hands, and that takes work because we live in a very visual society. So please do plan ahead. That's something that needs to be done very early on in preschool. If your child is going to get large print books, they need to be ordered well in advance. In the spring, in fact. Here in Virginia, it's March that we order them. March 14th, to be exact. So we have to order them by then to make sure they come by September. Children with special needs can qualify to stay in school a little bit longer throughout the summer. This is called the extended school year. And we do ESY if the child has a specific need that sometimes they degenerate over the summer. They lose a lot of what they learned. So ESY is used then. We want to communicate very early with teachers if our child is going to need ESY. And that's simply because they have to find the staff to work with your child during the summer, and we want to make sure they have enough time to do so. Again, here in Virginia, we like to know by February and March if we have to have a child in ESY. There's a lot of paperwork that goes with that.
Kim, it's
yes.
We're getting close to, we're about between the 45 and 50-minute mark, and I'd like to remind our participants this evening that you may ask questions, and I've been getting some, but I suspect that there are some more out there, and I encourage you guys to put them in there so we can make best use of the question and answer time.
Great. I'll try to speed through the rest. Orientation and mobility. I want to let you know there is a lot of low vision considerations with O&M, and I posted some of these on here. One of the most common problems I've been called in for O&M for kids with albinism is they have to go outside of their school, and there's 10 school buses with tiny little numbers on them, and each day their particular bus pulls up to a different stop, and they have to find their bus. So there's a lot of things we can do to help them and familiarize them with the school and so on. So, do consider asking for an O&M evaluation just to make sure there's nothing that's being overlooked for your child. We really do want to use very good communication skills with our schools. We want to stay in contact with them. I always contact my daughter's teachers to tell them, what she has. I write up a letter about her. I provide it my own words so they have information from me, and then also her special ed teacher. I encourage you to stay in contact with your schools over the summer to check and make sure that if you requested environmental adaptations that they're being implemented. So, for example, at a green school, I have a student at a beautiful school with great big atriums and big windows and built with this awesome green technology, but the child can't see there. So they had to buy some type of shades or awnings to cover up some of that, and we want to check to make sure that's in place before school starts. I think it's always important to know how and where to report a problem. I've had to do that a couple of times, both a number of times as a teacher and a couple of times with my own daughter. So it's important to do that, but it's also important to know when to thank somebody and compliment them very well, because we want to make sure the good teachers stick around. One thing that pertaining to advocacy that I don't have time to share a story about this. I really encourage you, if you're training the teachers, if you're talking to them, please also consider training the parent volunteers. I've had a couple of students who came into me crying because a nasty comment, or maybe it wasn't intentionally nasty, but a comment was made by a parent volunteer. Don't look so close. Don't look so close at that, or whatnot. We want to make sure those parent volunteers who are in the classroom with our kids are well acquainted with their visual impairment. I have some terminology on here, just things about talking about nystagmus as being dancing eyes, and being able to use some very positive terminology. I'm just going to briefly touch on documentation. These are ways that I document things. If you're in a meeting with the special education teachers and they say, oh yeah, we can refer your child for occupational therapy, and oh yeah, we can do this and that. We all know there are well-meaning people out there who forget things. So my encouragement to you is when you're done with that meeting, go home, write out an email, say thank you so much for meeting with me today. I appreciate your making a referral for the occupational therapy and O&M or whatnot, and I look forward to setting up the appointment. Just as a reminder, And I've done that as a parent, and I've been thanked for that because, you know, people forget, and that's unfortunate, and that's not professional. I'm not justifying them at all. But, you know, if it's my kid, I want to make sure their needs are being met. We do want to document when we're having problems getting accommodations, like if your child keeps coming home with materials that have not been adapted according to their IEP, you can just start documenting that and put, you know, this is a little form actually that I made for my students years ago. To document that they are using their accommodations, because sometimes they don't. And I wanted to document when they are and when they're not and why. And so this is something I devised, and you can take this, you can copy it if you like, and you can document when your child is using accommodations, when they're not. Was the assignment provided to you and provided in enough time to be adapted? And we can actually, you know, quantify this and see what accommodations they're using the most and so on. I just want to close by saying I have albinism too, and I actually grew up in a home where it was not ever disclosed to me that I am different. I learned when I went to school that I had bad eyes and that something must be wrong with me. And I grew up in a Caucasian area, so but I was still quite a bit whiter than everybody else, and I did not have services for most of my education. I went through school without large print, suffered from a lot of vision fatigue, you know, didn't have sunglasses. I lived in Colorado, didn't have a hat, and went through school, you know, wondering, is there something wrong with me? Do I have a learning disability or something like that? And it wasn't until I was a freshman in college I decided to not go to the ophthalmologist that my mom had taken me to for years. And I went to a low vision eye doctor, and I also went to a consumer organization that had emphasis in low vision. They had a convention, and I won a scholarship from them, so they took me to the convention. I learned about all the fantastic things. And you can see the semester that happened because my GPA went from a 2.7 to a 3.97 just by using accommodations and you know, really maximizing my potential. But what I'm trying to say is that I came out fine, and I'm doing great, and a lot of people are. Your kids are very lucky to have parents who advocate for them, and my family, you know, they just didn't know, and that's not something that I hold anger about, but it's something that I'm glad that there's so much more out so people can learn. And I want to let you know that your kids have amazing possibilities for them. Just because they have albinism doesn't mean they have any limitations that would stop them. So I thank you so much for tuning in tonight, and I'm very happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Kim. That was wonderful. Are you going to, I'm going to ask the first question. Are you going to put up the slide for where the materials can be found?
Yes, I can put that up right now, vipsite.org. And we can also, I don't know if there's room on NOAA's website to put them, but
I think we can arrange for that.
Okay, sure. But it's V as in Victor, IPSIGHT.org.
Okay, I have some questions here. We've got a few minutes that we can go over them. This is an interesting question, and I think it may lead in a couple of directions. Is every school required to accommodate an IEP?
Public schools, yes. Public schools, absolutely. Private schools, we can develop individualized service plans, but they don't have to take kids with disabilities if they have a religious exemption or some type of private club exemption. But public schools, yes.
Let me see here. Where did I put all the questions? One question that came up is you mentioned assessments that should not be used or should be done with some participation by the TVIs. Could you go back over that and talk about which ones you're talking about, and tell us? I believe that there was a slide or a website that you referenced in that.
Absolutely. Well, for example, one assessment that's frequently used is the Woodcock-Johnson 3. And this assessment is actually also provided in Braille and large print from the American Printing House for the Blind. However, they have made a very responsible disclaimer in those assessments that reads, just because this is enlarged or in Braille does not mean that this is completely valid for this population. It has not been normed, meaning they haven't taken a big enough sample of children with visual impairments and given that assessment to them. So even though that we have it in Braille and large print, that doesn't mean that it's a perfect assessment for those kids. So we might give them the assessment, and it might be just fine for your child if it's accommodated appropriately. But it's something that we do put the disclaimer that it has not been standardized on this population. So we use that as a piece of the puzzle to try to figure out if there's another issue going on. The visual motor assessment, the VMI, actually, I have a very sad story to say. There was a neuropsychologist who was giving that assessment to a number of preemies who were visually impaired. And it's a completely, the publisher of the assessment clearly says this is not intended not to be used for children with visual impairments. And that's a type of assessment. It's very visual. They have to copy some formations from these cards that are 2 by 2 inches, and they have to copy it onto their own paper. And this neuropsychologist was not using any adaptations, no 20/20 pens, no dark ink or whatnot. But that type of assessment I've seen used on a couple of visually impaired kids, but it's because it was appropriate for them. They could see it. It was accommodated. But we always put that statement in there. This was done with accommodations, so it's no longer considered standardized. And then some other assessments. There's tons out there. We have that they will always say in the preface if it's intended or not intended for a certain population. So if we are giving some of those assessments to the children, we need to make sure that the TVI is informed in enough time so he or she can adapt it appropriately and also decide, is this appropriate or is this not appropriate? And that's a very important key. And that's also why we oftentimes use checklists and informal documents as well to help get more information about the child.
Is there a place for a parent to go to find out what a 3-year-old should be able to do by the end of the school year? They didn't let me in school when I was 3.
That more pertains to some of the milestones, and some preschools will publish that. I always use a little bit of caution with that. I look at those developmental milestones, and I always, our school district has published some of those prerequisite skills and things they want kids to know by certain ages. For visual impairment alone, to answer your question, no. We do not have some great milestone charts for children with visual impairments simply because we have a very diverse population. And even if we sampled a group of children with albinism, we would not get enough information to make something very standard that by age 3 they should be doing this, that, and the other thing. But if you're looking for a general idea, any of the like the NAEYC groups, preschools that are accredited by that organization, they oftentimes have some information. The U.S. Department of Education actually has published several booklets and brochures that talk about what children should be doing by different ages, and that's on the U.S. Department of Education website. It's like their developmental guidelines and so on.
So is that sort of a resource, something that a parent could use to measure whether their child's development is quote unquote normal?
I would caution against measuring if they're normal or abnormal. It's good to know if your child is on the right track. I think it's important to we have some great inventories, and by inventory I mean it's a type of assessment that's oftentimes used in early intervention and early preschool, that we actually perform those assessments and we check off if the child has those skills or not. So that's something that I would consider doing if you're concerned about it. One thing I do get asked this question quite a bit by parents, and I always like to tell them, If your child is not meeting those milestones, like by 3 years old, that our pediatrician says they should be meeting and so on, I always look, are they making progress toward that milestone? And an example I give is, we have a lot of developmental specialists who say kids should be crawling by 9 or 10 months. And I have a lot of children in early intervention who are not crawling by 9 or 10 months. That to me is not a red flag. I am looking more toward, are they making progress to crawling? Can they bear weight on their hands and arms? Can they raise their head? Can they bring their knee in? Because those are the prerequisite skills for crawling. If they're not doing those things, I'm going to make a referral. But those timelines need to, be accommodated for our kids. So, in that case, I'm looking for, are they making progress toward crawling rather than have they actually met that milestone that the developmental specialist said is necessary.
Okay, here's a real interesting question. Who has the ultimate decision about an accommodation? The parent, the VI, the TVI, or the IEP team?
IEP team always. And as a team, technically we're supposed to agree, but obviously we always don't. But the real answer is the documentation and the assessments that we did is the ultimate decision maker. That is our data that we have on our kids. So I'll give you an example. I was called in on a case because the parents wanted the child to have something called a Mountbatten Brailer, and they came into the IEP team. The IEP team said no. So I was called in to do the independent educational evaluation, and what I found is that in my assessment, I'm not taking sides with anybody, but the child couldn't use a regular Brailer. This child had some other orthopedic issues and needed the Mountbatten because it's a lot easier to braille on. So my documentation, actually, because I did a full assessment, is what decides that. Same thing with adaptive technology. If I'm going to use, if parents are asking for Zoom text on the computers that the students are going to use, and the school district says no, I would absolutely ask them, you show me in the assessment data that this is not an appropriate technology for my child. And vice versa. You can ask them to do the assessment on your child to see if it's appropriate for them.
Okay, I have a specific question here. Can I get my own IEE, or does the school have to find one? Is the school required to pay for my own? And I guess I assume that is that question to mean that is the school required to pay for an IEE?
There's two ways to go about getting an IEE. You can go out and get your own that you pay for all by yourself. If you are requesting one through the school district, you need to request first for the IEE for it to be paid for, and it has to be something that is like the functional vision assessment IEEs that I do as a contractor. It's usually because there was not a qualified person doing the assessment. It didn't cover all of the big issues, and they simply requested one because there needed to be more information. So the parents went to the school and said, this assessment you provided does not provide enough information about my child's vision. We would like an IEE. In that case, the school does have to pay for it. So if you are looking for an IEE, if you want to pay for it yourself, then you don't need to go through the school. But if you do want them to pay for it, you need to give them a rationale as to why you need the IEE.
I'm not sure that I understand this question, so I'm just going to read it to you. Does natural setting apply to IEP or only early intervention?
Only early intervention. The natural setting is for the birth through 3 age range, and sometimes we have kids who transition out of early intervention at age 2. Actually, in the state I live in, we can start transitioning them at 18 months. But yes, the natural setting is for infants and toddlers. It does not apply. It's not something that we use in the 3 through 21 age group.
Okay, this might be this question might open up a can of worms, but I'm going to read it anyway. Mm-hmm. Let me get back to it real quick. It basically says what. Oh, I'm sorry. I scrolled away from it. Now I have to.
Is it a Braille question?
No.
I do, while you're looking, I do want to say, because I've been contacted by a lot of parents of kids with albinism, they say, should kids with albinism learn Braille? And I can never, ever, ever say that an entire group should learn or use any mode of literacy. It is solely up to the learning media assessment and the IEP team to determine that. So if it is right for your child, go for it. If it's something that's not good for your child, if it's not going to work, then, you know, investigate the other things. But we never say that one group, all kids with albinism, have to learn Braille. It's an individual thing. Nothing in an IEP should ever be, you have this condition, you do it this way. That is the antithesis of an IEP.
Okay, and that was funny. I had the question, and then all of a sudden it scrolled away. But it basically it is what? Oh man, where? I think it's because new ones come on.
Oh yeah.
It'll be here in a second. I guess the question basically is what? Oh man, I want to read this for verbatim because I don't want to screw it up. Actually, well, let me do another one in the meantime.
Okay.
What are some recommendations that you would think are best for speaking to your child's class to make them more aware of our child's visual impairments?
Oh, very good question, and it varies with each age of kids. So last year I did several presentations to preschools, kindergartens, and first and second graders, and the very first thing, because diversity is a huge topic in our schools these days, and where we live, we have very, very multicultural classrooms. So I come in and I talk about, you know, everyone has different eyes. Some people have blue eyes, some people have green eyes, some people have big eyes, some people have little eyes, some people have, you know, all these different characteristics. And then I start talking about, do you know that some people have eyes that move, and that some people have eyes that they can only see out of one eye? And, you know, we really want to emphasize that every kid has unique attributes. So, you know, in the presentation, we do something where we go around the classroom and each child has to say one thing that's unique about them. And for the younger kids, we send home a note like 1 or 2 nights before the presentation, and we ask the parents to help that child think about something that is unique about them. And so we really want to point out that everybody has something unique. So that's the starter. And then we talk about dancing eyes, karate eyes. Some people call it karate eyes that move with the moving eye. I talk a lot about, you know, for kids who have albinism, because I've had to intervene in some situations where kids have been bullied pretty badly, and, you know, we talk about what it means to talk about badly about the color of someone's skin. And it's a great character lesson, because it's not just about the albinism, but it's about the other kids who have different colors of skin in the class. And I like to make it really like that every kid has something unique and something important, and just because they see differently doesn't mean that they are odd, in so to speak. And then we go on, you know, I go on and do some other exercises with them.
Okay, I found it.
Okay.
What if the school is refusing to provide something you, parenthetically parent, feel is necessary?
Yes, that again comes down to the documentation. And let's say you don't want to go the route of getting an independent educational evaluation. If there's an accommodation, let's say you went to an NFB or ACB convention and you were in the exhibit hall and you saw a certain type of device that your child took to immediately, or you have an iPad at home and the child just really thrives with that, I would make a video journal and take some pictures and some video and show the child working through that device and how it's benefiting them. One thing that's very difficult, especially with budget cuts, is we all find technologies we would love to have and that we think would be great for ourselves or our kids. We really can't be in the position to buy a technology outside of what we have and use that, give it to the child and find that it doesn't work. So that's why the assistive technology assessments that I do, I have tons and tons of technologies. Vendors give me things. You know, I have my husband is an adaptive technology computer programmer, so I have lots of things from his company to use, and we test those. We go through each one. I never go into a setting thinking, oh, this child has albinism, they're going to need this, this, and this. I never think that. What we need to have is good concrete documentation that shows this device works for that child and that it's going to be useful in the educational setting. So if you can borrow the device or go to someone's house who has the device that you're thinking about and show that. And then if the school is really saying no to you, I would ask them to provide in documentation, in assessment form, why that's not going to work for your child. So if you think an iPad in the classroom is going to work, and they're saying no, I would ask them to document why. And when people are saying no to us, ask for it in documentation form. Ask for it in writing, in written form. Because as a teacher, when I have to write something down that says an iPad would not be useful for your child in the classroom, I have to, that puts a little different twist on it. And technically also in the IEP, we cannot write the names of specific technologies. So if your child needed Zoom text in the classroom, I don't write Zoom text in the IEP. I write screen magnifier. And that's simply because there are dozens of magnifiers out there, Windows 7, there's the one from Freedom Scientific and so on, and Enlarge from the Macs and so on. So we have to actually put the generic title. So instead of saying something like an iPad, we would say, the little notebooks or whatever the technical term for those are called.
Everybody is sticking with us, so I'm going to take the time. We're going to run a little over, but I'm going to ask a couple of more questions, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. Are we able to respond to new TVI if we're not satisfied with the assistance and direction they're taking our children or acting as our voice as a parent?
Responding to the TVI? I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part.
I'm sorry. Are we able to request a new TVI if the TVI isn't going the way the parents think it should be going?
Yes, and I will tell you right off the bat, I had to do that twice for my own daughter with special ed teachers that were working with her. Yes, where this gets tricky is some of you live in smaller counties that might only have 1 or 2 TVIs on staff, so that gets a little tricky. And if you don't like you're not getting along so well with the person, then that is, a problem. When you are requesting a new service provider, I'll tell you exactly what I had to do. I documented all of the problems we had. The person acted with very unprofessional conduct. We can never go and say to the supervisor, I don't like this TVI. So what? We all have personality differences. There's people we don't like in this world. That doesn't hold any water. You do want to go through each time something concerning happens, write it down, use very neutral terminology, make statements like, the service provider was late. The service provider, I will tell you, I had a TVI who came in and called visually impaired kids Magoo. And some of you may not know why that is concerning, and that's maybe you're younger, but Mr. Magoo was a fictional character who wore thick glasses and had a visual impairment, and he did silly things that were just obnoxious because of his eyesight. And so for her to come in and call people Magoo was extremely inappropriate.
Oh,
that
Magoo,
would be something
you've done it again.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and so that's the type of thing. If they are not doing, if they didn't make the referrals for all of the evaluations, if they're not ordering your child's materials on time, sometimes materials don't arrive on time because there's a delay at the warehouse or the shipping process or whatnot. I would just document these things, and if there's concerning things, you can always check credentials from your Department of Education to make sure a person's certified correctly. I've been called in on situations where a teacher of the visually impaired is teaching orientation and mobility, and that person does not have the credentials for O&M, and that is a huge issue because in O&M I have my credentials from ACVREP, and if for some reason I didn't renew it, I would never teach O&M. It's a huge liability. I'm teaching kids to go up and down steps and walk and cross streets and get buses, and if I make a mistake doing that, it can be lethal. So that's something that I would consider very serious. So you can request a new TVI. I would definitely document the things that have concerned you. Sometimes our kids aren't going to get along with their teachers. They're not going to like the teachers, and we all can remember teachers we didn't like, and that that is unfortunate because we get very close to our students and the TVIs and students. But I would document what your concerns are, and you can have your spouse or a friend or somebody review that and make sure that it's something that sounds very concrete and valid.
How often do you recommend kids get a full reevaluation for O&M?
O&M is interesting. That needs, for my kids, I reevaluate every lesson that I teach O&M. And first and foremost, I do want to say, if your child is given a cane by a teacher or an O&M instructor, that child needs some time with an O&M instructor. There are kids who've tripped themselves, fallen down steps, they've tripped their little brother, they've smacked people, real problems, gotten in trouble on escalators. There are techniques we have to teach. Kids with albinism technically don't, not all of them, but some of them don't use the full gamut of skills that we can provide, but we have to have some O&M time with them. The O&M eval, that would be up to the discretion of the O&M instructor, what's professionally acceptable. I would say I really formally try to evaluate the skills before each IEP, so I know what we're going to work on next. And these are sometimes very informal, but it varies. You might have a child who gets a little bit of O&M early on, and then maybe later on in 9th, 10th grade, they might need a little more O&M. So they could be re-evaled for that at that point if they're going to be taking public transit. One thing with albinism, we all know crossing streets when the sun is setting and you're trying to see the little light-up sign across the street, that's impossible. But there are some techniques and skills we can teach your kids to cross the street using clues from parallel traffic and from other information present in the environment. So you can request the evaluation anytime you want to if your child has not been receiving O&M.
Do you need an IEP meeting to add something to an IEP, or can it be done with the parents and the VI teacher?
Yeah, the addendum, sometimes we don't need to meet to do an addendum. For example, let's say we're going to add adaptive PE. We found in PE the child is having some difficulties doing things, so we're going to add adaptive PE. If the parents and the case manager are in agreement, the child needs the adaptive PE, oftentimes that addendum can be written up and you don't even need to go in for the meeting. Sometimes it might just be a couple of people who come in and you sign the addendum, but addendums have a little more flexibility with that.
A parent asks, my son just turned 3 and the family is moving to a new state next week. We will be attending, he will be attending a part-time preschool. Where do I begin to getting the IEP process rolling?
You would contact the county that your child is living in, and to pursue that process. If the child is going to a public school, just simply contact the local public school to ask about that. You might ask for, in our county it's called Child Find. That's for the ages 3 to 5-year-olds, so you might ask for that type of service, but I would merely just call the public school. If your child's going to a public school, I would contact that school and tell them that you have a child with albinism coming in and they can pursue that. If you're going to a private school, you can still contact your local public school and start the process. Here where I live, we actually were able to go to private preschools with kids. Now that doesn't happen everywhere, and there's some gray areas and provisions there that are different, but that's something we were able to do.
Okay, I have one last question that I'm going to give you the option on, Kim. It's a specific question about homeschooling in a specific state. Mm-hmm. Do we want to take that one generally, or should I maybe refer this to you offline?
Well, homeschooling is interesting because there's a couple of different ways that kids are homeschooled. Sometimes they're homeschooled because they have medical needs, and they have to be, they are homebound, and then there are families who choose the homeschool option. You can still get an IEP if you have a homeschool child. Okay,
so how about if I ask the question then?
Okay, great.
Do you know how the TVIs act with homeschooled students in Virginia?
Well, it depends on where you live. Here in Fairfax County, we've had a few homeschooled students, and they were not my students at that point, but the TVI, they had one of the young girls had a very fantastic TBI. So that one was a pretty good situation. I can't comment on everybody, but the situations I found were pretty good. But it just varies. You know, each case varies and each county varies too.
Well, Kim, thank you so much. This has been really wonderful, and I think we got a lot of good questions. I see that we've lost a couple of people, but most everybody has hung in to the end. I'd like to do just a couple of closing remarks. Just to remind everybody that the webinar will be posted on YouTube within the next couple of days. All the participants will receive an email in the next day or two asking you to fill out an evaluation. It's really important for us to get feedback to see if this process of doing these webinars is working and if the subject matter is valuable to you. When Kim and I were talking about putting this together, that we could probably do 5 or 6 different webinars on IEPs focused on different aspects of the process. I also strongly suggest that you keep an eye out for email announcements of NOAA webinars and teleconferences, and to check the NOAA website for future events. So you can either go to www.albinism.org or our events page, which is at http://events.albinism.org. To give you an idea of some of the things that are coming up, there is a grandparents discussion group coming up on Saturday. We are just about ready to announce a teleconference on self-esteem in your child. We're working on low vision driving and assistive technology webinar and what to expect from a low vision exam. So keep your eyes peeled for all that good stuff. Again, thanks everyone for joining us. We hope that this has been helpful. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mike.